The startup investment landscape is changing, and world-class companies are being built outside of Silicon Valley. We find them, talk with them, and discuss the upside of investing in them. Welcome to Upside.
Hello, and welcome to the Upside Podcast, the first podcast finding upside outside of Silicon Valley. I'm Eric Hornung, and I'm accompanied by my co-host, Mr. Perfect Robert himself, Jay Klaus. Jay, how's it going? What's going on, man?
Good, man. I'm glad you actually listened to that song. Did you listen to it?
No, I didn't. I just give you nicknames based on things that you send me randomly. What is Perfect Robert?
Went to a concert of one of my favorite bands recently in a cave in Tennessee, Cumberland Caverns, Tennessee. Band is called Murder by Death. They are not a metal band, not as intense as it sounds. And a good example of that is the fact that they have an entire EP for their band that they put on their Kickstarter that is dedicated to their dog, RoboCop. And so I was listening to that EP this morning, the 6-song EP about their dog, RoboCop. One of the songs is Perfect Robert.
Now, you didn't just go to a concert. You didn't just go to a concert in a cave. You put an extensive amount of effort to going to this concert. Is that right?
I put about 14 hours of driving in a day to go to this concert, yes. It was silly and logistically illogical.
And the outcome of going to that concert was me getting a new headshot because you recruited Susie to pressure me into getting a new headshot and putting it on my Twitter. So, full circle, we're back here at Upside. I have a new headshot. Jay is listening to songs about someone's dog.
Our online identities have gotten better because of this concert that I went to.
All right, well, Jay, what are we doing here? Well, this isn't a traditional Upside episode, is it?
That's right. Usually, we are here talking with a founder because Eric and I, one, love talking to founders, but two, think that it's a special time to be starting a company outside of Silicon Valley, and we talk to the founders who are doing just that. But today, we're taking a little bit of a different format because we are 14 interviews in to the Upside podcast. Actually, 16 if you count the 2 interviews that we did that will never see the light of day because we did not do a good job of them. And we said, 14 episodes in, we've been collecting feedback all along the way, and we're at a point where we want to start making some tweaks, maybe not some major overhauls. We'll see how the conversation flows, but we want to take that feedback seriously from you guys and see how it can and should impact the show. So today, Eric and I are going to be talking pretty candidly about the feedback we've received. We have not discussed this beforehand. A lot of this is going to evolve in real time as to how we're both listening to the feedback that we receive and how we are choosing to operate because of it.
To give the audience a little bit of background, Jay and I have been aggressive about finding and getting feedback. I think I counted through our internal Slack, and we had something like 70 or 80 different people who gave feedback, solicited or unsolicited. The unsolicited kind is the best kind, just FYI. And all of it was extremely helpful. So thank you to anyone who sent feedback, who had comments, who helped us make this podcast better.
And that's just the piece of feedback we're counting, right? Like we get anecdotal feedback on Twitter, via text from people that have our number, email. Most of it we do a good job of tracking in that Slack, but I'd say we're probably pressing close to 100 different data points.
So to give you guys a little structure for how this episode's going to go, I told Jay, come up with a list of 3 things that you took out of this feedback, 3 trends, 3 specific pieces of feedback, however you want to go about it, and I'll do the same. And we will go through our lists, we'll look at that feedback, and then we'll go into the takeaways and suggestions for either how we have incorporated it, how we're not going to incorporate it, or how we might incorporate it going forward.
That's right. And I told Eric, I'm going to pick 7 things.
Because Jay is great with instructions.
Or because, all themes are useful, and I figured our top 3 may be the exact same top 3, so we'll cover a different cross-section. We will have 6 different data points no matter what.
Okay, so Jay, let's start with my 3rd trend. This piece of feedback came across a number of different people, but it came very explicitly from a venture capital friend who I was having lunch with. And he said, you need to do a much better job of asking about numbers. And Jay and I think this was right around episode 6.
That's what I was going to ask. I was going to say, what time of our evolution here?
Yeah. So Jay and I sat down and we said, or I think I told him this feedback, and he said, what did you tell me?
And I said, well, you're the numbers guy, and so that's your job.
So I'm taking full blame for that. And I think that if you listen to anything before probably about episode 8, you'll notice that we are definitely a little lighter on the numbers. Since then, I have a scratch sheet of 12 key KPIs that I try to ask about depending on which company we're talking to, what I think the KPI should be. You'll even notice that sometimes we get a response which is we can't talk about that on here, which is great because that means we're asking the right questions.
Yeah, totally. I think if you listen to our earlier episodes, we were dancing around the numbers a little bit more, and I think you've done an awesome job, even to the point where sometimes I'm trying to ask questions and I can see on you're like, nope, I've got 3 more rapid fire numbers questions I'm going to get through right now because the time is right, and I'm sitting here just like almost trying to speak over the microphone and not quite getting it. I think you've been doing a great job on that. So,
and we've talked about making that a segment, some sort of like rapid fire numbers question to make it a segment in the show. We haven't incorporated that yet. We're not sure if we're going to, but just so the audience is clear, that was another suggestion that was kind of thrown out there and we're thinking about.
Yeah, and this idea of segments is something we'll probably touch on here later in the pieces of feedback and how we think about that. We're going to talk about it live because you and I have talked about segments before, and that comes down to one sort of key issue or point that I think we're going to touch on with some more of these pieces of feedback. So let me jump into my third piece. That is sort of related to the numbers. I've gotten a piece of feedback from a few people that they want to hear more assertions from us in terms of a stance on like an evaluation of the company or a definitive, would you invest in this company or not if you were an investor and you had money?
And that one is something that we have had a tough time with since episode 1. And I think
it's a sticky wicket.
I have not heard that phrase in a long time. Patrick O'Shaughnessy, who we both think is a great podcaster, he runs Invest Like the Best, recently had a back and forth thread with a couple other investors about this topic. How you both want people to come on your podcast, but you want to also kind of grill them. But it's this delicate balance. And I think Patrick's been doing this for 120, 150 episodes, and he's still having that problem of balance and trying to find the right balance. I think the younger you are, the harder the balance is. And that's not an excuse as to why we're not taking assertions. It's just maybe why we haven't been as bold about it.
And when you say younger you are, you don't mean our respective ages. You mean the age of our show.
Yeah, you're correct. The age of our show.
Totally. To give a little bit of behind the curtain, I mean, think about it from our perspective here. We want to showcase really great companies and we want to talk to them. And ultimately, we want them to be proud of this episode. Since we are not right now an investor who can ultimately say, here's some money, yes or no, they're coming on the show for a little bit of a PR opportunity. So we want this to be something that they enjoy coming on, that they are happy to tell other founders that this is a resource available to them. Eric and I are here to learn. But if we went on here and we're just tearing companies apart, it would not be a friendly show that founders are excited about going on or sharing the episode or telling other people to go on the episode as well. So it's a difficult balance. We're not here to mislead at all or give you guys not our honest thoughts. It's just hard to take that next step in what ultimately may or may not actually benefit the show.
So 2 things on this point. One, the idea of like grilling founders and kind of almost not embarrassing them, but attacking almost. I think that's done on things like Shark Tank. I haven't actually listened to much of the pitch, but I've heard that that's like the podcast version of Shark Tank. So I'm sure that the questions are a little bit more aggressive on there. And the idea is to say yes or no at the end of an episode. We explicitly didn't want to be another Shark Tank kind of feel. So that's one thing. The second thing is Jay and I are very selective about who comes on the podcast, which is maybe a reason why a lot of our debriefs are generally positive. I do think we're pretty good about
Yeah, I'd agree.
pushing out the cautions that we do have, but the companies that come on generally come either recommended or we found them or we're excited about them. So it's not like we're just getting a blank slate of companies walking into our door and we're putting them on the podcast. There's a kind of pre-selection process.
I would agree. And I would say to your point about the age of the podcast, as we do get longer in the tooth as a show, I think the leverage starts to shift a little bit and we have a little bit more flexibility and leverage to push a little bit harder. I mean, frankly, let me be a little bit more candid too. We're doing this show to learn and I'm not there yet.
Me either.
So,
but you will notice if you listen to the earlier episodes, maybe the first 5 and the most recent 5, we are definitely more open about the downsides in the debrief. I've noticed that at least.
Yep. Ultimately, we want it to be a good show. So we want to voice the concerns that we do have.
My second point is by far, the most consistent piece of feedback we get. And it is length. Not everyone, I shouldn't say that. It feels like everyone comments on the length of, if not the entire podcast, one of the sections of it. I know that the upfront was a big piece of contention for how long it was when it was originally 20 to 30 minutes. The length of the entire show being at 90 minutes seems to be a point of contention for a lot of people. But overall, that has been, I think, 70% of the feedback that we have gotten has mentioned length in one form or another. Would you agree, Jay?
Yes, and this is why I came up with 7 points, because I knew we would overlap on this. Consistently, we are told 90 minutes is on the long side, is a lot of the way people put it. 90 minutes is on the long side. And I think it manifests in more hesitation to start listening than people saying, I'm not enjoying the length of this show. So that's why we haven't changed it to this point. We have cut down the intro. As you just said, Eric, originally we had probably 15 to 20 minutes of intro, and we realized a lot of it was a little bit redundant with the questions we asked themselves or in the interview itself. So the interview has gotten much shorter, sometimes as short as 5 minutes, definitely less than 10 minutes.
The intro, not the interview.
Yes, the intro.
Right.
And it focuses more on facts and the research that we found that can guide the questions and less of us sort of hypothecating on what will come out of the interview.
So one thing that I think is funny about this length is there's this fun dichotomy because the 2 longest episodes we've had were Swannies and 10XTS. They were both 101 minutes. They were the only 2 podcasts which went over the 100-minute mark, and for their respective times, they actually, you know what? I think in general, they might be 2 of the most downloaded podcasts we have. I know that the 10XTS broke all the records for us. I think Swannies, when it was released, broke all the records for us. There's the conflating principle of having another person on there, an expert, but length in itself doesn't seem to be a deterrent for new downloads in those contexts.
Yeah, and I think we should talk out how we think we want to approach this, but I have gotten the opposite feedback too, where people will say it can be whatever length that it needs to be. I've had at least one individual tell me he'd be fine with it being longer. I listen personally to 2 and 3 hour podcasts, which is probably why we had a little bit of a bias in the first place in the format of this, of it coming in long, because I love that. I love when things go in depth. I love when you get a little bit more into the weeds and personal with an individual through the interview. So the length has never scared me, but we've gotten that feedback frequently enough that I think we need to address it in some way. And to me, I'm just going to not put you on the spot, and I'll say where I think this should go if we address this. I think to shorten the show, it's going to have to come out of the interview predominantly, and maybe a little bit out of the deal memo, but I don't think we can shorten our process is the problem. For us to get through the numbers questions that we have to get to, and for us to make the guests comfortable to share with us, and for us to get all the information that we would want from a founder to decide if we would invest in this person, I think we need at least an hour interviewing them. So whether we share that full hour as the final version of the show or not, I don't think we can shorten our process on that.
I think, and this might be a little controversial, but just because we get so much of this feedback doesn't mean that we need to accept it. And I think that there are other ways to get people who prefer shorter podcasts. And Jay and I are kind of thinking through some ways in an alternate series that might be interesting for people like that here on Upside. I am a fan of the long episode. I like it. I think it lets us kind of fully bore out and talk to a founder in the 3-part structure that I think makes Upside very unique.
Something that I think we could do a better job of that might help on this is creating the understanding in people that if there's a certain part of the show they don't want to listen to, since this is 3 distinct segments, they can focus on that segment or not focus on a segment because they're all about at the same point in each episode. About 10 minutes in, we're done with the intro. And with about 25 minutes left, we're done with the interview.
That's correct. All right. So the takeaway there is we are aware of the length feedback. As of right now, there's nothing that we see that we are probably going to cut. There may be additional pieces of content in the future which address the issue for different types of audiences. But right now, I think we're going to stay with our length.
The other option is kind of just heavier post-production, which as podcast producers involves either time or money. And we would have to make the cost-benefit analysis call of whether or not that's worth it for this sect of our audience.
True. Jay, what is your second point?
Second point, this is actually positive feedback.
Whoa. What?
Yeah. I know it's common that we would focus on the negatives and say, what can we fix? But this is a very frequent piece of feedback that I think is worth noting because even though it is positive, it's one of the things we hear the most. And that is interest and a lot of validation over the format of the show itself. We get a lot of people coming and saying, I really love the 3-segment format of research, interview, and then the deal memo. And that was something that you and I talked about super early on as crucial for us in doing this. As someone who's wanted to do a podcast for a long time, I always thought, I love talking to people. I want to do an interview. How do I not just have another interview show, which we think the market is already kind of saturated with? Is this just one-on-one interview style show? And so I think that validation that people like that unique format is a good thing.
It's really funny because this is probably, the format itself is probably what kicked off us actually doing this podcast. And I remember I was sitting in a hotel room in Fort Lauderdale working, and I was texting Jay, and I said, why can't we do a podcast? He said, I don't know. I want it to be unique, though. I don't want to do another interview podcast. Everyone does interview podcasts. There's nothing exciting about that. I said, fair. I happened to be reading the book Angel at the time by Calacanis. He laid out this structure for how to evaluate deals, and we literally just stole that outline and said, what if we just make this into a podcast structure?
Borrowed. Yeah, I remember this well. I was at my co-working space when we were having this conversation. My only goal for the day was I had to record an audition tape for LinkedIn Learning. And I was going to do that. I was going to get on the road and go home because I think it was literally, I was going to go to my parents' place because it was literally before like Christmas. And it was starting to snow a lot, and I was running really behind on getting this one very small thing done because I was just on fire about this idea and thinking this could work. This is unique. This is good. This is smart. I love hearing that feedback because we think that's one of the most unique aspects and important aspects of our show. I've said this in a recent episode. The third part of our show, obviously, I love talking to founders in the interview. The third part of our show, my show.
It's your show now. All right, fine. I'm out.
The third part of our show is probably my favorite part because that's where we learn the most and where we get to create a conscious and articulated understanding of the thing that we just heard, which is what will make us smarter and more able to do this.
And it's where we say dumb things. Seriously. Sometimes I go back and I listen to myself. I'm like, well, that wasn't the smartest thing I could have said.
Yeah, same.
I probably should do better. Like when I defined consortia on the 10XTS podcast, I completely messed it up. And you know what? Here we are. And now I'm going to get better at that.
There was something in the 10XTS episode that even when I was giving the editing notes to our audio engineer, Nathan, who's amazing, by the way. Shout out to Nathan, who just makes this show much more listenable than it would be if I was doing this in GarageBand. When I was giving him the notes, I almost cut out one of my questions because I thought that was a stupid thing to say. But then I also thought, I'll leave it in just because that's like a sign of me learning, and I'm not an expert yet. And I don't want people to think that I am yet.
That's kind of the point of the show, is we're always learning. So my third piece of feedback is kind of related to the length issue. It's kind of related to the numbers issue. It's kind of related to everything. And it's a question that I get a lot that I don't have a great answer to, which is, who is your audience?
Ooh, this is a very personal question.
Is it personal, or is it, it's personal because the audience is ourselves. That's why we started the podcast. Completely selfishly, we started the podcast for ourselves.
And so it stands to reason that our audience are individuals who are a little bit like us in terms of interests and stage of their, I wouldn't say career, but stage of their journey in learning about this space, which I think is at the intersection of entrepreneurship and finance.
So our audience is people who are interested in entrepreneurship and finance and that intersection, and thinking about it from a very early stage.
Interestingly, in the format itself is this intersection of entrepreneurship and finance, because you're finance. I am not finance. I am entrepreneurship, work with entrepreneurs, am an entrepreneur. That's the space I feel much more comfortable. I'm trying to learn about the finance space. And I don't know if I'm projecting here. I think you have the opposite sort of problem.
I think so as well. I think it's interesting because if we look at us as the example, that's true. We also have on Twitter a bunch of lists of people who we are interested in. And I'm unsure if they are our audience, if there's reciprocity there. Those are accelerators, the press and the media. Obviously, we have one for our podcast guests who are obviously interested. Founders and companies, community builders, and VCs. And I'm not sure which of those and how strongly of those each of those are our audience.
I definitely get a lot more individuals who are sort of in the startup space and are trying to learn and understand how the investment space works a little bit more. I also talk to a handful of guys like you who are background in finance and are trying to understand more about what the startup space looks like and how their skill set sort of applies to that.
All right. So it seems like you have a much better answer to this question than I do.
Well, I think about the marketing of this a lot. And when I talk with our intern, JC, I ask her to find places where this type of person is hanging out. So it's on my mind a lot. But it is a question that still, I haven't perfectly articulated it. The best way I say is people who have the interest at the intersection of startups and finance.
Very cool. All right, Jay, what's your third point?
First
point. I don't know. Are we going 3, 2, 1 or 1, 2, 3? I think we kind of flipped it.
Yeah, you went 3, 2, 1. I think I went 1, 2, 3. So the last point that I'll make is, nope, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to give you 2. And you can choose which one.
Let's do a bonus one. You give me 3 and then we'll do a bonus one for the people.
Okay. Third piece, and this is nuts and bolts, people talking about your audio. The people want to hear your crispy, clean voice, Eric.
Apparently my voice sucks. So the initial feedback by almost everybody was, wow, Jay's voice sounds so great. Eric, are you using a different microphone? And I said, nope, we have the exact same setup. Same exact setup. The only difference is that Jay records locally and I record via a connection into his device. So I think that's something we are going to change here in the future. And you should hear my voice a little crisper.
Yeah.
But my voice still might just suck. And then here we are.
I get your voice straight into my earbuds and it's great. But yeah, it is, it's a function of how we produce the show. We use Skype. We use a tool called Ecamm, which honestly is a great tool for what it is. And I can export a single wave file of Eric and I's conversation, same with the guest, but it filters his voice through the internet connection, so it's not straight from his microphone. If we both recorded locally, we could, in theory, and I know this is how a lot of people operate, put 2 separate local files together in sync so that you hear both of our voices from our local machines and our microphone setups. Which we can do. It's, again, a thing and a point of resources on the production side. But Eric, something you said recently in terms of producing something, is it better to put $1 into marketing or $1 into the product itself? And this falls into the product itself.
Yeah, and every dollar we can put into the product, I think, is going to pay dividends down the road, because you want this. The product has to be amazing, and we can worry about marketing when marketing time comes. But I like putting money into the product.
Bonus time.
Bonus time.
Pew, 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 pew.
You hear those sound effects? That's Nathan right there, our audio engineer. Just kidding, Nathan. That was Jay.
That is me. Cool. So last piece of feedback, another positive piece of feedback. Eric, want to end on a high note. I've gotten several points of feedback of people saying, I really like when you guys spend some time talking to the guest about what it's like starting in the Midwest.
And that's great feedback, because that's the entire premise of the podcast.
It is. But sometimes we spend more time actually explicitly talking to that point than other times. You know, Jeremiah talked about being in Louisville is great for him because it can be the franchise capital of the world for food. Sky of Lawn Guru. Doesn't make sense for him to be on the West Coast where there are no lawns. Some of these founders very intentionally chose where we are where they are because of geographic advantages. Some of them by happenstance who have seen that there's still advantages there. Some are of Tiller. But yeah, this is a good point of feedback to also receive.
Yeah, well, I am excited that people are excited about hearing about the different ecosystems, because we're going to be exploring a lot more of them in the coming episodes. We're going to get outside of just the Midwest. We're going to find companies that are in the South. We're going to find companies that are in Salt Lake City and Denver and Albuquerque, and maybe we can do some international ones. But all of those are going to have that section, and we need to make sure that we ask about it, about what starting a company outside of Silicon Valley is like specific to their ecosystem.
All right, so let's summarize what we've talked about here in terms of the points of feedback we've gotten, and if you even want to touch on how we're going to move forward on those pieces, let's make it happen. I know you've been taking notes, Eric. Let's hear it.
All right, so the 3 pieces of feedback that I gave, or that I summarized. 1, we need to do a better job of asking about the numbers. I think that's something that we've kind of started to do and will continue to do, asking about KPIs, numbers. I think one thing we can look at better is projected numbers. 2, the length issue. We decided that we are not going to sacrifice quality for length, and the idea is going to be still about a 90-minute episode going forward, but we'll look at some alternatives going forward as well. 3, who's your audience? Jay answered it succinctly. I floundered around. The idea is that we are looking at the intersection of finance and startups. Jay's 3 points. I'll let you do the...
Pew, pew, pew.
Wait, we're not at the bonus yet, man. All right, Jay's 3 points. I'll let you do what we're going to do about them. Number 1, more assertions.
Yes, and. Got improv on the brain. I agree. We don't have an elegant answer for this yet. We want this to be a good experience for our guests. We want it to be something that they're happy to share and happy to recommend. That being said, we are not going to mislead or not touch on something that we think is important to address. So Eric and I do a pretty good job of bringing guests on the show who have already shown some signs of viability, I think is a good way to put it. I think we'll get there as the show gets older, but as of now, it's a tough line to toe, and we'll continue to do our best to toe that line.
2, format of the show. This is a positive piece of feedback.
Keeping it.
Done. 3, Eric's voice.
Yeah, we'll fix it. And I say that from the standpoint of, oh boy, more post-production, but it is something that is important, and so we will probably in the coming, I don't know, I don't want to say next episode because we're about to record that interview and we are not equipped to do that. So in the next 5 episodes, you will hear sometime in the next 5 episodes a crispy clean Eric Hornung.
And the bonus.
Pew, pew, pew.
Bonus! I didn't write down what the bonus was. I forgot.
Talking to founders about the Midwest. Want to make sure we get some time on each interview to do that. We usually do it towards the end of the show anyway. It's a good sort of wind down. So we'll make sure that we continue to ask those questions and get that perspective.
So Jay, transparency is really important to us here at Upside. That's why we do this episode. That's why we're trying to interact with all of our listeners. How do listeners, if they have feedback, if they have questions that are either specific to an episode or more general about Upside and the way that we do things, how do they interact with us, either publicly or privately?
Well, Eric, I'm glad you asked. Not hard to do. We are both on Twitter. Upside is on Twitter. Preferred is to tweet at us at UpsideFM. Also fine. We both have our individual Twitters, which are tagged in the Upside bio. Eric has a new headshot, a new bio. It looks great. We'll both be listening for you there and on the Upside account. We also interact with our listeners on Breaker, which is our preferred podcasting app. If you use Breaker to listen to podcasts, you can comment on our episodes. You can also like our episodes, which is great. Helps us in the discoverability in the ranking system. But you can comment on our episodes and we will talk with you right there on the episode itself, which we're really enjoying doing. If you don't listen on Breaker, I would recommend giving it a shot. Eric and I both use that as our personal podcasting platform of choice. I've successfully swung my behavior into sort of habitually going into Breaker instead of Apple Podcasts at this point. And we think you'd like it too.
And what if people like emailing better? They got something long form they want to write out.
They can email us hello@upside.fm. We would love that as well. We categorize all this feedback. We put it into Slack. We'll probably do another one of these shows someday. If we make substantial edits to the show, or if we continue to get feedback towards certain directions, we'll revisit this again. At some point, we will send out a listener survey, so be on the lookout for that. If you want to receive that listener survey, obviously we'll shout it out in the podcast itself, but you can also sign up for our very infrequent mailing list at upside.fm, and you'll get a notification every time we release a new episode, and that's also the first place we will go with special news, special offers, things like the listener survey.
So thank you very much. If you've given feedback to this point, if you were one of the 70 or 80 people we had, plus all of the other anecdotes, I got to give a special shout out to John Vedalero, Eric Welker,
Mike Albert, Brett Buchanan, Arnab Nandi,
Ben Kelly, and Colleen Huster, who have all provided a ton of really specific, relevant, well thought out feedback. We really appreciate all you guys. And if we miss someone specific, we'll get you in the next feedback episode.
All right, Eric. Talk to you next time.
That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's guest, so shoot us an email at hello@upside.fm or find us on Twitter at UpsideFM. We'll be back here next week at the same time talking to another founder in our quest to find upside outside of Silicon Valley. If you or someone you know would make a good guest for our show, please email us or find us on Twitter and let us know. And if you love our show, please leave us a review on iTunes. That goes a long way in helping us spread the word and continue to help bring high-quality guests to the show. Eric and I decided there were a couple things we wanted to share with you at the end of the podcast, and so here we go. Eric Hornung and Jay Klaus are the founding parties of the Upside podcast. At the time of this recording, we do not own equity or other financial interest in the companies which appear on this show. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinions of Duff & Phelps LLC and its affiliates, Unreal Collective LLC and its affiliates, or any entity which employ us. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. We have not considered your specific financial situation nor provided any investment advice on this show. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Never mind, bro, that can't be matched. I'm lighting it on fire, used to run victory laps, and still I'm not even tired. It's all about the timing, yeah, that's what they say. Well, I'ma keep on rhyming, find a way and get it on the face.
Uh-oh, we're back. Little Easter egg.
Bonus part 2. Pew, 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 pew. Realized that I mentioned 7 pieces of feedback, and I gave 5, or we covered 5 of my pieces of feedback. So, rapid fire, last 2 pieces of feedback. 1, given that we have a consistent format that people are excited about and enjoy, we've gotten the pieces of feedback that some of our intro to the show itself, both in the intro segment and in the deal memo, where we talk about what are we doing here, sounds a little scripted and they're tired of hearing it. So that's a hard one to address because we want people who are coming to the show for the first time to have a feel for what we're doing. We also don't want to alienate our listeners. So Eric, what do we do with that?
think we're going to start doing it less and less, but it's still going to be part of the show because we are getting so many new listeners every single episode. We're still in that kind of high growth phase. So I think it's important for setting the structure. We might be able to do it less going forward. What do you think?
I would agree. We've talked about this a little bit. I think we shorten it. I think we, instead of doing every episode, we might reintroduce segments every third episode, but also shorter. I think it's important for people to understand the format. And honestly, again, given that some people have length concerns, I really want to get people in the third segment because I think that's where a lot of the magic happens. So I want to make sure that in the intro, we are sufficiently getting them excited about that.
Awesome. And what's your second piece?
Last piece of feedback. Here we go. One of my favorite things and also most frustrating things about our pod, Eric, is the capitalization of the messaging we use for the podcast.
I love the lowercase. I love it so much.
This began as a clever little nod to the Midwest. We started everything lowercase to say that there's not enough capital here outside of Silicon Valley. I love that as a concept. Love it. What's really difficult is to consistently write everything lowercase and not look like a couple of idiots.
Yeah, but it also just like brings a little bit of attention when you see everything in lowercase. You just even if it's just like a second take, maybe it annoys some people, sure, but so does writing everything in uppercase, and that seems to work well on Twitter for some people.
Kanye. What's hard for me is I don't like to lowercase proper nouns that are brand standards for our guests. So it's hard for me to justify lowercasing. Maybe I could get away with their names, but to take their company name and lowercase that feels a little disrespectful to me. So I started not doing that. And now we have this weird mixed bag that's hard for me to draw the line.
Yeah, I think proper nouns can still have uppercase unless they are our possession of proper nouns, like my name, your name, upside, things like that. But other people's stuff, yeah, you got to be respectful of that. I agree. I think that we've done a good job of that, especially lately. We might have been a little bit aggressive with the lower casing earlier on, but we've kind of changed that. So I think
aggressively undercapitalized.
We are aggressively undercapitalized. Yeah. All right, Jay. So you went through all your pieces of feedback. I think it's time for a little song for the listeners if they stuck around this long. What do you think?
Ah, yes. He's a perfect Robert. How did he get so good? Yes, he's a perfect Robert. He does everything that a good boy should. He's perfect Robert.
All right. Later, guys.